Mr. Jekielek. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we are very pleased to have you here. My first question is, what led you to investigate the allegations of China's forced organ harvesting, and why you read this book now?
Well, so first of all, Killed to Order, the name of the book, it's kind of a compendium of 20 years of research of amazing people who got into the research back in 2006, which is also when I first realized that this was real, okay? I heard about it through two channels at the same time, and at the Epoch Times, we reported on it at the time. One was, there was a whistleblower, a woman whose pseudonym is Annie, and she alleged that there was a camp of sorts, a concentration camp, where people, Falun Gong practitioners, were being held to be killed to order for transplants, basically, okay? At the same time, there was another situation that happened, which there was a head of the transplant surgery department at Tel Aviv University. He actually had a patient. His name was Jacob Levy. I'll probably talk about him a little bit later as well, because he became an activist. He had a patient who had been waiting for a heart transplant for a long time. And one day his patient told him, you know, and I was chilled to the bones as Jacob was recounting this to me. In 2 weeks, he was going to get a scheduled heart transplant. And from the perspective of, you know, Jacob had been the head of the Israeli Transplant Association at one point, right? He said, that's impossible. There's no way, because you would know when someone's going to be killed. But the guy went and got the transplant and came back to Israel. So both these, there was this whistleblower from China whose husband had been a surgeon who actually had done these. He admitted to his wife that he had extracted 2,000 corneas from living people, and he had been having nightmares. That's why she forced him to confess, and she decided to come forth. And then there was this head of a transplant surgery department. And those two allegations together, and a little bit of research, which I can tell you about more about, I realized this is horribly true and crazy. It's really hard to believe.
Okay, let's talk about the book. The title is Killed to Order, and in practical terms, what does it really mean? How does this system actually work?
So what you need to have something like a state actor. It's a very unique situation, okay? Because you have to be able to push coercive power through into a population. You have to be able to propagandize a population heavily, basically to dehumanize a group of people that you're going to use for this, okay? And the second part is you have to be able to have the power to incarcerate a huge group of people, maybe 1 million, okay? So this is what the Chinese Communist Party did with Falun Gong practitioners back in 1999 and 2000. Okay, this was spiritual discipline. The government estimate was that 70 to 100 million people were doing it. It was very grassroots, very different than very hierarchical communist structures. And the dictator at the time, Jiang Zemin, decided to use his words, eradicate it, okay? So a group of people practicing truthfulness, compassion, forbearance were suddenly, you know, on the most wanted list. And to justify that, they pushed this mass propaganda into the population to justify to their fellow man. You know, 1 in 13 Chinese was doing this, right? People had to believe that it's somehow okay to persecute these people. And when you have this dehumanization situation now and this mass incarceration, they put perhaps 1 million, maybe 2. We don't know the real numbers. This is all kind of a state secret. You know, you can be killed for revealing these numbers. I don't know if anyone even knows the real numbers. That's when they started blood typing, tissue typing, organ scanning these people. And so before 2006, there were actually ads online that would say, for $200,000 or $150,000, you can get a new heart in 2 weeks, right? It's just kind of unbelievable thing to see, right? But why can that be done? Because the so-called donor is ready to be killed to order, already matched to you, right? The moment you pay that cash, they find the right person, they ship that person, and they kill that person to order. This is a whole different level. This is not run-of-the-mill black market organ trafficking, which is, of course, horrible in itself. This is a whole different level and a whole different scale. Like, it ramped up to 60 to 90,000 transplants by our best estimates per year by the late 2000s.
Wow. You just mentioned the Falun Gong practitioners. Are there any other group of victims in China other than Falun Gong practitioners? And why do you think Falun Gong practitioners and the other group of people are vulnerable to
This is such an incredibly important question. Thank you for asking it. So, in a communist system, okay, there's always an external enemy, which is, by the way, always America. That's how they set it up. But there's also an internal enemy, which is different. Sometimes it was the landowners when they wanted to seize the land from the landowners, okay? Sometimes it was the students and the student movement in '89, okay? But in 1999, it became the Falun Gong. And that becomes why does it become a vulnerable group? Because the regime basically says, we're targeting this group. And there's two purposes to this. One is because they want to somehow suppress this group or get rid of it. The other thing is it's a message to the rest of society. This is what the Communist Party can do. Don't get on the wrong side of us, okay? So what happened is really no one did much for about 14 or 15 years, even though we had a lot of evidence by then that absolutely this forced organ harvesting is happening. I can get into some of the details of that if you want. But this is what happened, right? There was this small group of Uyghur Muslims in the Xinjiang region of China. Okay, small group meaning smaller than Falun Gong. It's not that small. It's 10, 12 million or something like that people, right? But they did the same thing. They dehumanized them. And also as an ethnic minority, they were already being dehumanized by the Chinese communists. They kind of have this approach, right, of making these people vulnerable, right, by saying they're kind of lesser than human. The reason you need to do the vulnerable part, okay, is that most people aren't psychopaths, right? You have to kind of create, you create a kind of a flaw, it's a flaw in human reasoning. The moment that you start believing that someone is less than human, that allows you to do terrible things. This is why genocides happen, and that some of the people that commit those genocides aren't actually psychopaths. They're not heartless people, but somehow they've been convinced, right? And so they dehumanized the Uyghurs. They incarcerated 1 million plus of them. It's unclear how many. And to our best knowledge, especially through the work of an amazing researcher on this named Ethan Gutman, it looks like they were added in significant number to this whole monstrous kill-to-order industry. And my big fear, right, is if we don't act on this, right, now we have the Falun Gong and we have the Uyghurs, we're going to be adding perhaps Tibetans, because that's another vulnerable group that's being propagandized against and targeted, and more recently, house Christians. House church Christians, recently a big church, right, Zion Church, all the leaders were arrested. They're still, many of them are still incarcerated, and we have recent controls on Catholic clergy. I don't know where that leads, but it looks to me like the regime is ramping up persecution of Christians right now, and I'm worried that these groups will be added in significant number as well to this whole kill-to-order doctrine.
Right. Given the topic, the seriousness of the topic, both inside and outside of China, people have little or very little knowledge about the truth. My question is, what will be your biggest or strongest evidence to tell people that this is really happening? We know a lot of our viewers have questions about it. They have doubts because the issue was not being publicly or being discussed, debated enough. So what will be your strongest evidence to tell?
100%. You're exactly right. So let me give you a big part of kill to order, okay, is the evidence. And I kind of bring together the evidence of the better part of 20 years. But let me give you a few examples, okay, that can help, okay? Actually, I think I was looking in chapter 1 on page 17. One of the original reports that was written on this was by 2 Canadian human rights lawyers, David Kilgore and David Matus. And they started with 17 lines of evidence, and then they came up with 33. Now, here's the thing you have to remember, right? No journalist has suddenly stumbled into an operating room and, oh my God, look, they're killing someone to order, right? That hasn't happened. This in mass atrocity situations, right? When the Holocaust was being enacted in Germany, they weren't inviting journalists to show them what they were doing, okay? So the evidence pulled together initially, right, was circumstantial, but very compelling, right? Examples were, researchers would call hospitals and say, can I get an organ in 2 weeks? Absolutely, right? They would call, can I get Falun Gong organs? People would say, yes, absolutely. We have the freshest, best, healthiest organs. Falun Gong were known to be that way. Okay, that's one line, right? Another line, right, something much more recent, right? A man named Matthew Robertson, who is a researcher on this, recently published an amazing PhD thesis on this issue. He wrote a paper with Jacob Levy, that same surgeon I mentioned earlier, okay, who became an activist to try to stop this atrocity. They did a research around basically the Chinese transplant literature, published, official, some even in Western journals, Chinese transplant literature. And they found 70, just from about 2,000 and some papers, they found 70 or more violations of the dead donor rule in the published public research, okay? And what does that mean? That means that the way that those 70 people, or in those 70 research studies, the way people died was their organs being extracted. They were murdered by having their organs extracted. And they wrote that into their research methods, okay? And the reason they wrote that, this is now my opinion, the reason they wrote that into their research methods is that is by far the predominant way in which transplantation has been happening in China for the last 25 years. So people don't know any other way, and they don't even fully realize that what they're doing is murder, right? In some cases, they just do it as part of the process of doing transplantation. There's examples where, actually I have one recent example, and this is utterly shocking. This was verified through a former explant surgeon from Germany who spoke with me. He's aware of one scenario where a woman, get this, okay? She has a serious liver problem, and she's an extremely heavy drinker, okay? And has a kind of a rare situation with her liver too. She has gotten, on 3 different occasions, 3 liver transplants in China arranged for her over the course of, I think, 10 years, maybe a little longer, okay? Think about it. How is that remotely possible, right? Because remember, right, in any ethical kind of situation, right, you have to have someone that matches you. So there has to be a catastrophic accident. The size of the organ has to be right. The blood type, the tissue has to be matched. That's why people wait years, right, in a civilized society for this to work. Over here, 2 weeks, they've got the person ready to be killed to order, right? I have a whole chapter, chapter 5, basically dedicated, this is a very long chapter, dedicated to all of the research. And I'm happy to tell you, a lot more of it if you'd like.
You mentioned that estimated number of transplant surgeries being done in China annually is about 60,000 to 90,000. I was wondering how those numbers are coming from. What is your evidence?
Absolutely. No, that's an excellent question. It's obviously unbelievably difficult to estimate because, again, it's a state secret.
Right.
You can be killed for revealing it, right? So this is how the CCP makes it very difficult. Mm-hmm. And I just want to, I forgot to mention one incredibly important line of evidence, and I'll just mention this, okay? Because in all these years of allegations, okay, the Chinese Communist Party has never, not a single time, provided any information to challenge the allegation. Mm-hmm. All they do is slander the messengers. They say these are evil people, don't listen to them, this is propaganda. They never say, here's the real evidence that suggests this isn't happening, right? So at this point, with the voluminous evidence that we have to assume that it is happening until they provide extensive evidence that it's not, because we have to get them to stop it and then provide that evidence, right? Yeah. So in other words, because of 25 years of working on this and them never literally providing, even with the survivor, incredibly, there's a survivor of this, okay? He's missing part of his liver and part of his lung. They actually admitted to operating on him. I couldn't believe that we got that kind of an admission. A few of us, there's a legal professor who actually rescued this guy at Catholic University, Bob Destro. He was the former DRL secretary in the previous Trump administration, and he was like, I can't believe they admitted it legally. They've just kind of revealed themselves. So there's, it's just kind of it's shocking. Now let's get to the 60 to 90,000 that you asked me about. Okay. The way you figure this number out, there's an example. One of the pieces of evidence is a detailed study of a single hospital, okay? We call it a hospital built for murder, okay? That was the name of the article back in 2016 when we published it in the Epoch Times. So we looked at this hospital because this hospital was announcing that it had doing lots of transplants. It was cutting edge. It was rivaling some of the American hospitals, okay? But then when we looked deeper and we looked at the number of patients there, the number of hospitals beds in use, the growth of that one hospital, these guys, they were announcing we're like one of the top hospitals in China for transplants. But the reality was they were doing 10 times or maybe 20 times the actual transplants that they even admitted to. So they were basically kind of lowering the number dramatically to prevent someone being like, hey, wait a sec, that's completely impossible, the number of transplants that you're even talking about. Because at that time, they didn't even claim to have a natural organ registry, like people actually donating organs. That didn't exist. And I could explain why we believe it still doesn't really exist, even though they claim it does. Mm-hmm. So that number comes from looking at that one hospital and many others, okay? And then basically that's why the number is so broad, right? 60 to 90,000. 60,000 is really the low end, 90,000. I think, Ethan Gutman had estimated 100,000. I kind of just bring it down a little bit, right? Because I want to be extra conservative, okay, about this. I don't want to over promise or something. But think about those numbers, right? It's a very extreme reality. We're talking about, probably, and of course, multiple organs can be harvested from a single body. That's true, especially since the advent of ECMO technology, which kind of takes care of your lung and liver, basically, lung and heart. It just sort of acts as a bypass for that, so you can keep a body alive for transplantation longer. Right. But I think we could estimate that more than 1 million people have been killed this way over all these years. I would guess it's a lot more than that, but again, to be extremely conservative, right? I think but the truth is, the CCP is not giving us numbers saying, here's how many transplants we've done. We don't know their economic numbers, the transplant numbers, forget it, right? So we're trying to figure this out as best we can. And I think at this point, the evidence is very compelling.
Great. So as you mentioned that the CCP is hiding all the numbers, not just the transplants, but other kind of statistics. But Beijing has consistent or repeatedly said that it has stopped use prisoners' organs back in 2015, as early as 2015, and relies exclusively on voluntary donations. But I think pretty obviously the evidence suggests the other way. So. Can you give us maybe one or two examples that contradicts Chinese government's, positions?
Well, so one thing, just for general knowledge, culturally in China, Chinese aren't really big on giving up organs. So that's a kind of a problem for them. But let's leave that aside for a moment, okay? Let's go back to Matthew Robertson's PhD thesis, which I mentioned earlier. This is actually something that was published, I forget in which journal as well. But what he did was they actually published numbers of a transplant registry, the growth of their transplant registry since 2015 when they claim to have started one, okay? And what Matthew was able to demonstrate kind of very, very decisively is that it was a perfect quadratic equation. Okay, basically, like human data is erratic. A perfect quadratic equation means that they created a formula and they invented the numbers.
All right.
It's wild, right? Mm-hmm. And again, the problem is the incentives are all in the wrong way. This is kind of like with slavery in the American history and other countries. When you have dehumanized a group of people and you just have them to use as fodder for whatever purpose you want, like for example, organ transplants, it's very hard to shift from that because you've got the bodies, right? And it's just how the system works. You know how bureaucracies, even in America, you're trying to change a bureaucracy, it's very difficult. They've spent 25 years building a kill-to-order bureaucracy around organ transplantation. So how do you shift to voluntary transplants when most Chinese don't want to give organs, right? It's a complete sham. Inside China, we actually had this amazing revelation recently, which was this hot mic moment, right?
Yes.
You're familiar. So Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un are in Tiananmen Square, and they start discussing living forever through continual organ transplantation. Unbelievable. And having worked on it all these years, it had never occurred to me, because they mentioned, Xi Jinping said 150 years is our target, right? And all of a sudden I was like, my God, that's Project 981. Project 981 is the elite longevity project. Chinese elites live significantly longer than the average person. How does that happen? It never occurred to me that part of it was this continual organ transplantation. They have unlimited organs available to them forever. What is that worth? By the way, the numbers that we have for the annual value of the industry, you mentioned it's an industry, is about a $9 billion industry. That's a kind of, again, a very rough calculation based on a median price per organ, okay? But now, like, to have unlimited organs available to you forever, wow, that's worth a lot more than $9 billion in my mind.
For the US, should this be treated purely as a human rights issue, or does it carry national security implications?
Wow, we could talk for a whole hour on this question, okay? I think it has deep, profound national security implications because we're working with a regime that has killed to order as a standard part of its operating methods, right? So if we understand, like as a diplomat, if I'm working with the Chinese Communist Party, I have to understand I'm not working with a normal government. I'm not even working with a normal dictatorship, right? I'm working with a totalitarian dictatorship, and I've actually explained the distinction. There's this amazing scholar at Stanford named Chenggang Xu, who's actually explained this distinction in detail, helped me understand this. But the critical part is that communist societies destroy all semblance of civil society. So we're working with a regime that believes that all civil society, all sort of emergent activity among the population that isn't under direct government control should be destroyed so the supremacy of the party can be maintained. Okay, so at a fundamental level, that is the most important message, okay? But at the same time, right, I just wrote an op-ed about this a few months ago in the Baltimore Sun. We train those surgeons in significant number. We provide all sorts of solutions and technology. We fund some of those hospitals that are involved in forced organ harvesting. We have partnerships between research institutions. That, let me put it this way, okay? In China, one of the top 7 national priorities, as Xi Jinping elevated it, is military-civil fusion, okay? Mm-hmm. So you can imagine, right, there's even been allegations that if there was going to be an invasion of Taiwan, they would start using Taiwanese soldiers, right, as organ donors. So this is anything in China, bottom line, that has a military dimension to it, that military dimension is explored because it's one of Xi Jinping's top priorities. Right. So, the national security implications are massive.
Okay. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's such a pleasure, and thank you for the excellent questions.